Here, guys. Um, yes, we should record this because I know some people have asked for the recording afterwards. So thank you for having me today. It's great to be here. Been looking forward to doing this workshop for you guys. I know that as Sydney mentioned, and actually, let me go through the agenda first and do a quick introduction, which Sydney kind of did already. I'm going to talk about the recruiting timeline today. Also, I'm going to talk about what I consider the four boxes that you have to check in order to be successful in the investment banking recruiting process. And I have a free gift for you guys at the end. And I want to save time for some Q&A. Okay, so I think we've allotted about an hour for this workshop. My presentation will probably be about 45 minutes, I think. And then I'm happy to stay on as long as I need to for however many questions you guys have. So we can go past the hour. If you guys have to drop, no worries. But if you guys have questions, feel free to just jot them down as we're going through it. Then at the end, I'm probably just going to ask you guys to drop your questions in the chat once I open up the Q&A, and then I'll just go through the list and try to answer as many as I can. Okay, so with that said, let's just dive right in. And I'm going to be flying through this stuff just because, we don't have that much time. And so I want to make sure I touch on everything, but it's going to be probably a bit more high level. And then whatever questions you guys want to go more in depth on, feel free to just hit me with the questions afterwards. All right. So I can probably skip through most of the introduction stuff. Kind of Sydney already covered this. Only thing she probably didn't mention is I also worked in tech at 3 different companies: Square, which probably everyone knows what Square is; GitHub. Most people know what GitHub is, especially if you're an engineer or in computer science. And then a third company called Enjoy Technology, which actually just went public yesterday. So that's pretty cool. So if you guys have, I feel like I've had a pretty well-rounded set of finance work experience across, sell side, buy side, tech, finance. So if you guys have questions about some of those other career paths as well, I'm happy to answer questions about those also. Okay. And as Sydney mentioned, we've worked with probably around 25 students from Penn and Wharton to date. You guys are actually, I would say, either the top school or maybe number 2. I think it's you guys or Cal. I went to Cal, I went to Berkeley, which is probably why I get a lot of students from Berkeley. But I would say, obviously, as you guys all know, a lot of people from Penn and from Wharton want to get into banking. And so you guys typically, historically, do very, very well. So it's great that you go to school at Penn and at Wharton. So that's a little bit about us. So with that, so let's dive into like the meat of the presentation. Okay, so I always start these presentations by talking about the recruiting timeline. And actually, before I go into this, if you guys can do me a favor and drop in the chat just what year you're graduating or what class you're in, just so I have a sense for like who's here, because I see like 33 people, right? Are you guys mostly freshmen, sophomore, junior, seniors? It'll just give me a sense for who I'm talking to. Because obviously, some of the recruiting strategies and whatnot will have to change slightly depending on what year you are. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of 2024s. Sydney's 2023, but obviously Sydney's done. 2025, okay, Mark, getting out ahead of it. Good job. Okay, so I see mostly 2024 and some 2025. So freshman and sophomore. So that's great. So let's talk about the recruiting timeline, right? So I like to work backwards. Obviously, the ultimate goal is to get the offer from one of these top banks by the time you graduate from Penn, right? Now, that process for the full-time offer starts at the end of your junior summer, typically around early August, because most of the full-time offers first get handed out to the junior summer, right? And so some of this stuff might be kind of basic for some of you, but I'm going to start from like the lowest common denominator for those of you that are like completely new to this. Okay, so most of the offers go to the junior summer interns and they get priority. So they're going to wait until the end of that junior summer internship, which is typically 10 weeks. And then so it starts in June, it ends in early August. And then if there are still spots that have not been filled by their returning summer interns, which either means the interns they hired weren't as good as they expected, so they didn't give out as many offers, or they didn't hire enough interns because there's so much deal activity and they just like underhired, right? So in either of those scenarios, they will go out and try to fill the rest of the class with one more cycle of full-time recruiting. Just for context, like this is probably, I would say like out of every 10 jobs that are available, this is like the last one or two job that's probably available during full-time recruiting. So most of you here though, sound like you guys are not juniors and seniors, probably because all the juniors and seniors at Wharton have already gotten jobs, so they don't care about this. So for you, what you care more about is how do I get that junior summer internship, right? And so the thing to know about the junior summer internship recruiting timeline is, again, a lot of people when they're new to recruiting, the number one thing that surprises them the most is how early these applications open up. Okay. And so it's been opening earlier and earlier every year, which is really, really annoying, especially as a student. And the reason why banks do that is because they're all competing with each other to try to get the best candidates possible, right? And so like RBC is notorious for doing this. They've been the first bank to open their applications for the last at least the last 3 to 4 years. I wasn't tracking this before that, but like the last 3 to 4 years, RBC always tries to get out there before the bulge bracket and elite boutique banks. And so like this year, they opened their application in like the first week of October, right? So we're at the end of October now. So it's been almost a month. And so that's not a reason for you to freak out though. Like, so we're in October now. I think typically what we see is that the first wave of like bulge bracket and elite boutique applications are probably like last year, I would say it was like 3 to 4 months after RBC opened. So last year it happened in like mid-January, right? Was the first wave that we saw. So this year, like nobody knows when the rest of these banks are going to start the process. I mean, unless you work in HR at these banks, but based on historical trends, because it starts a little bit earlier every year, and last year it started in mid-January, my guess, and this is just an educated guess, is that the 2023 summer internship process, or the applications at least, will probably start opening up early January or maybe like before the end of the year. Probably not between Christmas and New Year, right? Because people aren't working around that time. So that's kind of the timeline that you're working, that you're up against, and that's the timeline you want to keep in mind. And you want to try to be fully ready before that time comes, right? So I put here before the end of the calendar year. I think that's a good goal for those of you who are in the class of 2024. Okay. And so the only other thing I'll mention here is too, is like, there are some of you here that are in the class of 2025, right? There are also freshman and sophomore internships, right? You don't have to wait until your junior summer to do an internship. In fact, it's pretty much a prerequisite nowadays for you to have probably ideally at least 2 or 3 relevant internship experiences on your resume by the time you have to apply for your junior summer internship. Okay, so by the time you're about halfway through your sophomore year, ideally, you don't always have to, but ideally, you already have 2 to 3 internships on your resume, and not just like a marketing internship or a sales internship. I'm talking like a finance internship, right? So we'll talk more about that. If you are a diversity candidate, then it'll be a little bit easier for you. So the definition of diversity for these banks is like if you're female, if you're African American, if you're Hispanic, Native American. There's other types of diversity, like if you're LGBTQ, if you are, if you have some form of disability, if you are, if you have military experience, so they have like programs for veterans. Those are like different diversity programs that are out there. So a lot of the bulge bracket, elite boutiques, and even some of the middle market banks, I would say like, if you look at the top 50 banks out there, a lot of them will have these diversity programs, which means you don't have to wait until your junior summer to intern with them. You can actually intern with them starting sophomore year, definitely, but sometimes some banks will even have programs for freshmen. So if you're a freshman right now, and even if you're a sophomore right now, like there are some sophomore students now that are getting summer internships for their sophomore summer already. Like one of the students that we're working with, she just got a Goldman summer internship for her sophomore summer, right? So like this stuff is happening in real time. I saw an application for a Credit Suisse sophomore summer internship. So like if you are a freshman or sophomore, you also want to be paying attention to those. If you're not a diversity candidate, let's say you are a, I don't know, straight white male, right? And you don't qualify for any of these, then you want to still pay attention to some of the other smaller firms that are out there. Okay. So it doesn't have to be a bulge bracket or a elite boutique or any type of bank like that. It could be even just like a smaller regional boutique bank, right? Or it could be like a small private equity firm. Like what's more important is that you get relevant experience, and I'll talk about what that is in a bit, as opposed to like, oh, the name of the firm that you work at, right? Like one common question that I get from people is like, oh, Sam, should I work at a small regional investment bank, or should I do like I don't know, Goldman Sachs private wealth management? Like if I have both options, which one is better, right? And my advice to people is always to go for the smaller investment bank, as long as they're actually going to give you real work. Okay, so that's, anyway, the recruiting timeline. Make sure you guys stay on top of this. Like we do a lot of interviews with our clients after they get offers, and then like we always ask them like, hey, what's one piece of advice that you have for people who are about to go through recruiting? And the most common piece of advice that we get from people is like, start early, right? Just like start as early as you can. There's no such thing as starting too early, because it's just so competitive. And like the earlier you start, the more you're going to be able to finish, right? Or the more you're going to be able, the more boxes you're going to be able to check off. Okay, so let's talk about what those boxes are, right? I think that's a good segue. So it's pretty straightforward. You guys probably can guess what these are, but if not, it's 1, your resume; 2, networking; 3, your answers for your behavioral interviews; and then 4, a conceptual understanding, okay, for the technical interview. And I emphasize conceptual understanding because a lot of people, what they do when they prepare for the technicals is like they don't understand the actual underlying concepts, and they're just trying to like memorize all the answers to like the 400 questions or something. That is a really, really horrible way to study this stuff, because you're not just only going to get the exact questions that you memorize during these interviews. So you really have to understand the concepts behind it. Okay, so let's talk about each of these 4 things in a little bit more detail, right? So first thing, resume. Like this should always be the first thing you work on, by the way. Okay, and so there are like several different elements to your resume that you have to pay attention to. I'm going to like list them in order of importance. Okay, so the first one is obviously your GPA, right? And so for your GPA, anything above a 3.7, I would say is ideal, right? 3.5 or above, I would say is okay. And by okay, I mean like most investment banks out there, they won't have like an explicit hard GPA cutoff. Once in a while, we do see that on the application where they say, hey, you have to at least have a GPA of X. And I've never seen that threshold be higher than 3.5. So what that means is, as long as you have at least a 3.5, you won't like automatically be eliminated from a process due to your GPA, right? Now, I say 3.0 minimum, meaning it's not ideal if you're in the lower half of the threes, but we have seen students get jobs even with like GPAs in the low threes, right? Like the lowest GPA we've ever seen someone get in with, at least the people that we worked with, is someone with a 3.0 GPA. So don't go there if you don't have to, obviously. And I would just say like the lower your GPA, the stronger you're going to have to be everywhere else on your resume, right? So what's everywhere else? So the next thing that I would say is just as important as your GPA is your work experience. So we kind of alluded to this earlier, right, on the previous slide. So I said ideally have 2 to 3 relevant internships. What's considered relevant, right? That's always the question. So I kind of listed out different types of internships here that you should try to go after in order of relevance. So like the most relevant, obviously, would be an investment banking internship. Doesn't matter if it's a big bank or a small bank, but it's like an investment bank, right? I would say the next most relevant thing you could do is probably working at a private equity firm or a search fund. Search funds are just like, it's like private equity, but on a much smaller scale, right? Like they make smaller acquisitions, and they usually only acquire one company as opposed to an entire portfolio, right? Hedge funds, family offices, these are, places that obviously are still investing in stocks or investing in companies. Equity research, valuation firms, corporate development, which means you're doing M&A, but instead of doing it for a bank, you're doing it in-house at an actual company. Okay, so the common thread through all of these different internships is that you're analyzing companies. Like the core of your role and responsibility is that you're analyzing companies, because that's what you're going to be doing if you like end up working in investment banking, right? So people might be asking like, okay, well, what about, I don't know, an FP&A internship, or a corporate finance internship, or even an accounting internship, or private wealth management. Like, yes, you can do those too. But I left those off this list because in my mind, there's a pretty big drop off in terms of relevance from the stuff on this list to kind of like that next tier of internships, because you don't do as much like company analysis in some of those other roles than you would in these roles. Okay. So not saying like, hey, if you have one of those internships, it's not good to have, like you should still have it on your resume. But you only have so much time, right? So there's an opportunity cost. If you say, hey, between now and when recruiting is over, I want to try to add another 1 or 2 internship to my resume, and each internship you're probably going to do for at least 2 to 3 months, you have to kind of pick and choose what you're going to spend your time on, right? So work experience is the next, I would say, is like this and GPA, 2 most important things that you should make sure you're spending time on. Extracurricular activities, I would say this is like, still important, but not quite as important as the first 2. So this is obviously joining orgs like, WFC, Wharton Woman, right? Even WITG. Like a lot of you that are on this call are probably already in some of these clubs. So that's great, right? And the purpose of joining these clubs is like, one, obviously there's a lot of professional development. There's a lot of upperclassmen that have already gone through the process, and they can obviously be a resource for you and help you out. But also the other thing is like the network, right? There's a lot of alumni from these organizations that are already working at these banks. And the next thing we're going to talk about after this is networking, right? When you reach out to the alumni to network, especially from a school like Penn or Wharton, there's going to be so many students hitting up these bankers. These bankers are so busy, and they don't have time to talk to every single person, right? So they're going to have to pick and choose. And if you are from the same student organization that they used to be a part of, they're going to be more inclined to help you, right? And so highly encourage you guys to join one of these clubs if you're not already in one. Only thing to know is like, and I don't know if this is the case for these specific organizations, but in my experience, on most campuses, most of these clubs only recruit new members when they're still either freshmen or sophomores. So you want to make sure you try to join as early as possible. Okay. So that's the next thing. And then like the last 2 things that are on your resume typically is like your skills and interest section. These are like probably the least important, and people don't pay too much attention to it. But I would say just to spend a quick 5 seconds on it, like for skills, it's usually your language skills, any programming skills that you have, or like any relevant software skills that like, so Bloomberg, CapIQ, FactSet, Thomson, like these are software that people use on the job regularly in banking. And so like if you've used some of these, maybe like during an internship or just from school or whatever, like you should definitely list them on there. It's not going to make or break you, okay, but it's just good to have it. And then like for the interest, you can be a little bit strategic about this. I just view this as conversation starters. This is like what you use to break the ice or build rapport with your interviewers, right? Or even with like a banker you're networking with. If they see, so the 2 angles, it's like either you have something really, really unique or really, really interesting, and people, when they see that, they always want to ask you about it. So like, for example, I have a friend who was on the show American Ninja Warriors, right? Like that's a really interesting thing, right? And so you might have something like that. So that's specific to you, right? Or if you have an interest that like a lot of bankers would also have that as a common interest, right? So this could be, I don't know, you're kind of like profiling the bankers a little bit at this point, but it's like maybe a lot of bankers like, I don't know, playing Texas Hold'em or something, right? Or they like watching shows related to finance. Maybe they like watching Billions, right? Or whatever. So it's like, if you have those interests, you want to list them. Don't list things that you aren't actually interested in just because you think that, oh, that's something that the bankers will like, because there have been instances where someone listed something, and this is never going to be the thing that gets you a job. But like, if you list something, sometimes bankers will be like, oh, so you're interested in this, let's talk about it. And then when it becomes very knowledgeable that you're actually not truly interested in that thing because you don't know how to talk about it, then you lose all credibility, right? So don't say you are a, I don't know, New York Giants fan just because you think a lot of bankers are New York Giants fans. You don't know anything about football, right? So anyway, that's your resume, right? Like these are the things that you should be thinking about if you're not already. And then I shouldn't say once you're done with that. Along with working on your resume and along with building out those experiences. Oh, by the way, one more thing I should say on that. This is the substance of your resume, right? The other thing that's really important is the formatting of your resume. Okay, so I'm sure Wharton has a lot of like resume templates, especially if you're in these clubs. Like they all have different templates. Um, you have to make sure your resume is cleanly formatted and that you're utilizing the real estate on the page really, really well. Like it should look pretty compact and not have too much white space. Okay, because if the resume has too much white space, it basically gives off the impression that this person didn't do that much, right? And one thing that most people don't realize is bankers don't actually read every single bullet you write word for word because they don't have time to do that. When you submit an application, the banks will get a stack of resume that's like hundreds of resumes or sometimes thousands of resumes, and then someone will be assigned, usually like a low level, like usually like an analyst or something, and they'll be assigned to go through those resumes, right? And they already have a lot of work to do aside from screening resumes, so they're usually spending like, I don't know, no more, probably anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds on a resume at most. So a lot of it is first impression, like visually, does this resume look good, right? And the other reason why formatting is so important is because in banking, like I would say probably 30 to 40% of your job is going to be formatting pitch books. Okay, so if you have poor formatting, then you're telling these bankers that this person is probably not going to be very good at 30 to 40% of their job. So you're probably not a good candidate. So make sure you spend a lot of time formatting your resume, making it look nice. And then, you know, as part of the free gift I'll be giving you guys at the end too, like there's a resume template in there if you guys need to use it, but I'm sure that like there's a lot of good resume templates out there. Use whichever one you want, right? So anyway, networking, like you should be doing this once you have, I would say like at least one relevant experience on your resume. Okay, and I say have at least one relevant experience on your resume because usually like if you don't have anything on your resume, you're not going to get a very good response rate from the bankers. Like again, bankers get so many requests from students who want to network with them. They have to pick and choose, and they don't. It's nothing personal, but they don't want to waste their time talking to someone who doesn't have any track record of like demonstrating that they're actually interested in this field, right? And so your goal for networking, you should be very deliberate about what you're doing, right? The way I tell our students to think about it is your goal is to get at least 1 or 2 referrals for interviews at every single bank that you plan on applying to. Okay, and I say 1 or 2 referrals, like obviously at a minimum, you want 1 referral, right? You need someone from the firm to be like pulling for you from the inside, right? But I say try to have more than one because we've seen time and time again students who thought they had a referral at a certain place, and then for whatever reason they just end up not getting an interview regardless, right? It could be a lot of things. It could be the banker said they were going to refer you but then they didn't really mean it, or they said they were going to refer you and they did refer you but they just didn't have that much influence, or they were going to refer you but they got busy and they forgot, you know, like there are a lot of things can happen, right? So you want to try to have some redundancy if you can, but at the same time you don't need like 5 different people to refer you from the same bank because you only have so much time that you can spend on networking. So rather than getting 5 referrals all from the same bank, I would rather go spend that time on another bank that I maybe don't have a referral for yet, right? Because if you really think about it, what most people end up doing is you probably want to apply to all the bulge bracket banks and all the elite boutique banks. And you probably even throw a couple of like other middle market banks in there, like Jeffries and Houlihan Lokey. And like it's easily 20 banks, right? 20 to 30 banks probably. So if you're applying to 20 banks and you say, okay, I want to get 2 referrals at every single bank, that means you need to build relationships, really, really solid relationships with at least 40 bankers, right? And that's a lot of bankers, right? And so that's the goal. Okay. Now, in terms of how you actually do that, the way we like to think about it is to treat it like a funnel. Okay, it's like a funnel that you have to optimize. And what does it mean to treat it like a funnel? It means that you're gonna put a bunch of bankers in at the top of the funnel, and you're going to gradually lose some bankers along the way, along each step of the funnel. And really only a very small percentage of these bankers are actually going to make it all the way through the funnel. And the bankers that actually make it all the way through, that's the 1 or 2 referral that you get in the end, right? So meaning, going back to the example of, hey, I need 40 referrals. If you want 40 referrals to come out the other side of the funnel, that means the top of your funnel needs to be a lot higher than 40, right? Like I've never met a person that has like converted, every single banker they talk to into a referral. It just doesn't happen. Not even 50% of the people, I would say. Like if you're converting 10 to 15%, like you are, I would say, like a networking savant. Okay. So like that's something to keep in mind too. Is like that's why networking is another thing that you have to start early, because it's extremely time consuming. You're gonna have to email a lot of people, right? And you're gonna have to talk to a subset of those people that you ended up emailing, and then a subset of those will actually end up helping you, right? So the top of the funnel, really, like what are the things to think about in terms of how you optimize it? It comes down to like, who are you targeting, right? How many people are you reaching out to in the first place? Where are you finding these people, right? And by that, I mean like most people just think, oh, I'm just going to reach out to all the alumni from my schools. Yes, you should absolutely reach out to all the alumni from your school, but like that's the low hanging fruit, right? That's what everyone's doing. So like, who else can you reach out to that maybe would be able to help you? But maybe other people at your school aren't necessarily reaching out to, right? And also like, how are you prioritizing? How are you stack ranking this list of people that you're reaching out to? Like a lot of our students, like when they initially go and we help them brainstorm this, and they initially go and create this list of people that they want to contact. And LinkedIn is always like the best tool to do your research, right? But you might end up with like a list of hundreds of bankers, right? Like hopefully you will. And if you don't, then you got to build that out over time. But like you're not going to reach out to like 200 bankers all at the same time, right? So you should prioritize the ones that you think are warmer leads that are going to be more likely to help you for whatever reason. Maybe they're in the same club as you. Maybe it's a family friend. Maybe, I don't know, you have some sort of other connection, right? Or maybe you guys have a mutual friend or whatever. Like you need to start with the people that are going to be more likely to help you first. And then like at the end of the day, those people, even if they may or may not be able to like actually help you get an interview or refer you, but even if they can, a lot of times they'll be able to refer you or introduce you to other people, right? So that's where you always want to start. So that's top of funnel, right? Middle of funnel is more like, okay, now you have this list. How do you make sure that you get a response from them, right? Because, and those of you who have already started networking, you know what I'm talking about. It's like a lot of times you send out a cold email and then you never hear back, right? Like that happens more often than not, I would say, right? So you have to be really strategic and really put some thought into like what you're saying in your email, right? And this starts from the subject line, which determines whether people skip over your email or whether they actually open it, to the body of the email. Like, is it a well-written email? You want to be concise and to the point, because bankers are really busy and they get hundreds of emails a day. Nobody wants to read a book, okay? Like, keep it concise and to the point, like choose your words carefully, and it has to be written in a very professional manner. If it's not professional, like if you have a typo, if you have grammar mistakes, or you're like rambling, like people will just skip it. People will just delete it. Like no one has time for that, right? Also, like the best thing you can do is like, if in your email you make it clear, like the reader, the person who's reading your email, if they can get the feeling of, or get the understanding, like, okay, I understand why this person is reaching out to me specifically. Out of all the people out there that they could have reached out to, they chose me for a reason. That's going to massively increase the likelihood that you get a response, because you're being targeted. Versus like some people, what they do is like, they'll just have like this exact same email and just copy paste, spam it out. There's no customization, and they spam it out to everybody. And it's very clear when you're doing that. That can work, but like your response rate is going to be very, very low. Then you're just playing the volume game, right? Then you have to probably send that out to not even hundreds, but probably like we've seen people send out thousands of emails before, right? So you got to think about your approach. And then like also, you should expect more often than not to not hear back to your first email. Okay, so a lot of people freak out when they don't hear back to the first email. They're like, oh, like this person doesn't want to talk to me. Like, no, it doesn't necessarily mean they don't want to talk to you. A lot of times, I mean, not a lot of, sometimes they actually don't want to talk to you. It's true. Like some bankers just won't talk to students, right? Again, they're very busy. They have families, they have wives, they have kids, girlfriends, whatever, boyfriends. So they don't have time. But other times, like people actually don't mind paying it forward, and they were in your shoes not that long ago, so they understand this is how it works. But maybe they're just busy. Like your email is going to be the lowest priority email out of all the emails they get, because all the other emails are either from their bosses or from their clients, right? And usually their bosses and their clients only email them when they're asking for something, so they're always going to prioritize those. So even if they see your email and they read it and they decide, okay, cool, yes, I do want to talk to Danny, okay, but I'm going to come back to this later after I'm done with all my work. And then sometimes they just forget, because then like by the time they're done with all their work, they've gotten like 50 other emails, and your email's on like the third page of their inbox, and then, you know, out of sight, out of mind, right? So you have to follow up if you don't get a response. In fact, you should just manage your expectation that, hey, the first time I email, I'm never going to get a response. Like that should just be the default assumption. And then if you do get a response on the first try, like great, that's just like, you know, bonus, I guess, right? And so, but you want, when you follow up, you need to make sure you're doing it in a way that's persistent but not annoying, right? You don't want to be that person that like can't take a hint, and like you've already emailed so many times and they're not responding. It's like at some point, like I would say after 3 attempts, if you're not hearing back, then you got to stop. Okay. And also, like, you need to give people enough time in between your emails. Like, don't email them today and then like first thing tomorrow morning you didn't hear back, and then you email them again. It's like, yo, you just emailed me yesterday. like, like give me some time to get back to you. Right. So make sure you like, this is also why like networking, you gotta start early, because there's like lead time from like one touch point to the next. And sometimes like everything doesn't always happen right when you want it to. Right. So that's middle of the funnel stuff. Bottom of the funnel is like, hey, okay, they responded, they agreed to talk to you. Now you're either going to get on a call with them, or like, depending on where you are and where they are, like you might go to the city and say, hey, I'm just going to do a bunch of coffee chats in person with a bunch of my networking contacts. But whatever it may be, if you get to have like the 20 to 30 minutes of FaceTime with the banker, now like, okay, that's like crunch time, right? That's like, you've gotten over the hardest part, which is getting them to even give you the time. And then you have to know like what are the right questions to ask, right? Because probably half the time is going to be you asking them questions. And so a lot of people ask really bad questions, and that'll basically just guarantee that they're not going to help you. The other thing you don't want to do when it comes to asking questions, I see a lot of people do this where they basically have like a predetermined list of questions. So it's like 10 canned questions that they ask to every single banker, right? It's like, with no matter what the banker says, they ask the exact same 10 questions. And it's just like, if you think about it, that's not what you would do if you were to like go on a Tinder date or something, right? Like you would like go in the flow of the conversation, and depending on what the other person says, you would maybe have a follow-up question to that, right? So you don't want to completely predetermine what you're going to ask. You have to like, you can have maybe a handful of questions ready in your back pocket that you use as like a conversation starter if the conversation stalls out. But as much as possible, once you've started like a new thread in the conversation, and as they're answering a question, the best thing to think about is like, okay, what follow-up question can I ask based on the thing that they just said? Right. And if you can do that over and over and over again, then the conversation is going to flow a lot better. And then there's like different frameworks, like, you know, that you should try to come up with your own framework. So like, I'm not a big believer in like verbatim scripts that you follow, but I am a big believer on frameworks where it's like, there's a structure to, hey, here are like the 4 or 5 things that I want to make sure I accomplish in this conversation. Here are the 4 or 5 things that I want to walk away with. And this is like the order that I want to go in when I'm asking about it. So they kind of like build on top of each other. Right. So anyway, put some thought into that. And then also, you got to be prepared to answer questions too. Okay. Like a lot of times the networking conversation is not just you asking questions, but the bankers want to get to know you a little bit too. So These are typically going to be more behavioral than technical. Okay, so we'll talk about this on the next slide too, but a lot of people always want to like jump into learning all the technicals or doing the technical prep. And then I find that a lot of students actually neglect the behavioral aspect of interview prep. That's a mistake because you're going to have to network first before you can get the interview. And I would say, like in my experience, about 5% of the questions during these networking conversations might be technical. That's like when you run into that banker that's like super hardcore and he just like turns it into an interview, he might start asking you technical questions. But that's the exception and not the rule, right? Most of the time, they're just having a conversation with you. They're just getting to know you as a person, and they're going to be asking you the more behavioral questions. And if your answers to those questions aren't well thought out, then like what they're doing is they're actually evaluating you, right? They're trying to make a determination in their head, like, okay, I know why this person's trying to network with me. Do I want to give them what they want? Do I actually want to go out of my way, like stick my neck out and vouch for this person, right? And they're not going to do that for everyone. Like out of all the students that are reaching out to them and all the students that they've talked to, like at the end of the day, they might refer, in my experience, most bankers might refer like one or two people, right? Because they have a limited amount of political capital in the office. They can't just like go back every single time and say, hey, here are 10 students I've spoken to. You should interview all of them. They're all great. Like no one's going to do that, right? So think about your behavioral answers carefully. And I would do that first so that you can use it for your networking. And then your technical stuff, for the most part, you're not going to need until you actually walk into that interview room. Okay. The last thing I have here is just like think about how you nurture the relationship too, because one mistake that I see a lot of people make is like they just they have that initial networking conversation and then the relationship just ends there, right? They kind of think like, okay, well now I've talked to them, yeah, it was a pleasant conversation, but hopefully when I apply, the banker will just remember me and then they'll just like help me out. Like that's too passive. It's not how it works. You have to nurture the relationship. You want to like touch base with them periodically, follow up, and stay on their radar. And then like when the time comes to actually apply, you definitely want to touch base with them at least one more time so that if they were intending on helping you, they don't forget about you, right? So anyway, that's networking. Let me go to the next section. So the behavioral interviews, which I kind of already started talking about. This, like I said, is probably the first part of the interview prep that you should work on. I like to break this down to 5 different types of questions. Okay, so the first is what I call the guarantee questions. These are the most important questions that you have to nail in an interview because these are questions that are guaranteed to come up with every single bank you talk to. And these are questions that are typically asked at the very beginning of the interview. So if you have like really, really good answers to these questions, you will make a great first impression. And then the rest of your interview will be a lot easier. If you have mediocre answers for this or just like horrible answers for this, like then your interview is pretty much over because the way the human brain works, like we all as interviewers and we have this cognitive bias where we decide within like the first probably 30 seconds whether we like the person or not. And then we spend the rest of the interview seeking evidence, like looking for validation for that decision we already made in the first 30 seconds, right? So like, if I don't like you, I will just keep asking you harder and harder questions and try to trip you up so that I can justify not moving you on to the next round, right? We've also had students who said, oh, I messed up on a couple technical questions in the interview. I'm not sure if I passed. And then they get the offer. And usually when that happens is because the interviewer likes you so much as a candidate that they're willing to forgive you for making a couple mistakes here and there. Like we can justify in our heads like, oh, well, like that question was kind of hard. So who cares? It's not a big deal, right? So you have to make sure you nail these 3 questions. Okay, tell me about yourself, which sometimes is walking through your resume. It's basically the same question. Why do you want to do investment banking? Why do you want to work for our bank? Okay. The other 4 categories, resume questions. So anything you list on your resume, you have to be able to talk about it in depth. Okay. You have to be able to not just like explain what you did, but you got to be prepared to answer follow-up questions because a lot of bankers, what they like to do to see if you actually did what you say you did is they'll ask you like for like a lot of the more detailed stuff. Like, oh, you say you worked on this deal at this investment banking internship. Oh, okay. Well, what were the comps that you guys used? Like, what was the multiple ranges, right? Like, what were some of the things that you what were you sorry, I'm just reading a message from in the chat. Okay, got it, Carolyn, no problem. What were some of the what were some of the other targets that you guys evaluated, right? So like, if you say, I don't know, I don't remember, like that's not a good answer, right? And so what I always tell everyone to do is like every single bullet point that you have on your resume, go through it and ask yourself, if I were to get grilled on this specific bullet, what would I say about it? And if you can't answer that question, you need to take that bullet off of your resume, because you're just going to shoot yourself in the foot, right? And also, a lot of people I know, like, we try to like puff things up on our resume, or like we tend to exaggerate a little bit in terms of like how much we actually did. It's fine if you want to do that, but just make sure you study whatever it is that you're talking about enough so that you can speak to it intelligently. Okay, so that's resume questions. There's strengths and weaknesses questions, which are pretty self-explanatory, right? People ask you about your strengths and weaknesses. The only thing I'll say here is like, make sure whatever strengths and weaknesses you talk about, you want to position yourself for investment banking, right? So like for the strengths, you should pick the strengths that actually are important for the investment banking analyst role, right? Like if you're very analytical, if you are good at time management, if you have great attention to detail, you're really good at multitasking, like those are the types of examples that you want to have, right? And then on the weakness side, like obviously, the two biggest mistakes that I see are people using fake weaknesses, like, oh, I'm such a perfectionist, or oh, I like work too hard sometimes and I just take on so much. Like those are like not real weaknesses, and bankers hear them all the time and they just like kind of roll their eyes, like, oh, okay, whatever, right? Like you don't want to do that. Like it's okay to have real weaknesses. They know that everyone has weaknesses. They're seeing if you have the self-awareness to know where your weaknesses are, and also like, what have you done about it? What have you done to work on those weaknesses? You got to be able to talk about that, right? And then the other thing too on the weakness side that we see a lot is people using like a detrimental weakness. So like, oh, I'm not that great with numbers, or oh, I like to procrastinate a lot sometimes. Like those are not the qualities that those are qualities that would make you a horrible analyst, right? So you don't want to say stuff like that, right? So and the last thing I'll say too is like sometimes they'll disguise the strengths and weaknesses question, right? To like make it a little bit harder. So instead of asking like, hey, what is your strength, or what is your greatest strength? They might say, hey, so I see you only have a 3.5 GPA. Well, there's all these other kids at Wharton that have 4.0. So like, why should I hire you? Right. And then people kind of like freeze up. It's like, oh, I don't know. Like, yeah, I don't have a 4.0. What they're really asking for, you got to learn to read between the lines. Is like, what are your strengths that make you stand out from everybody else? Right. And so you have to be able to like decipher that and then answer the question with the answer that you prepared. Okay. Last two type of questions, situational questions. This is like, tell me about a time when you did XYZ, right? Tell me about a time you demonstrated leadership. Tell me about a time you worked in a team. Tell me about a time you overcame a challenge, whatever, right? Like, so there are certain scenarios that are really popular in banking interviews. So you got to figure out what those are. And then what I would recommend is having 3 to 5 stories prepared that are flexible and that you can easily adapt to the different scenarios, because you're not going to have a different story prepared for every possible scenario out there, right? So for example, typically your teamwork example is going to be probably also work for your leadership example a lot of the times. I'm not saying always, right? Or a lot of times like your example for overcoming a challenge will also work for like a time that you experienced a failure, right? Like a lot of times those things are similar. So just think about it, like what else can I use this story for? And then have 3 to 5 of those stories prepared, right? And then lastly, market or deal related questions. So these are more like, tell me about something that's happening in the markets. Tell me about something that's going on in the economy, talking about like what the Fed is doing, inflation, so on and so forth. Talking about a deal that you've been following, whether it's an M&A deal or IPO deal, and then like doing stock pitches, right? These are all like market related questions. These can come up in banking interviews, but they're especially even more prevalent if you're interviewing for like capital market roles, right? So like ECM, DCM, LevFin, so on and so forth, right? So these are the behavioral questions. And then let's lastly talk about the technical interview. So similarly, I would say there's 5 different categories here, and I will learn them in this order, actually. Okay, so because they kind of build on top of each other, at least the first 4 do. So accounting questions. So you got to know the income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement, right? And you got to know what every single line item means on these statements. And most importantly, you got to know how they all link together. Okay, and so linking together is usually the hardest part, but you can't know that until you know this other stuff, right? Next, there's valuation questions. So you got to know the difference between equity value and enterprise value. And then you got to know the 3 main valuation methodologies, which are trading comps, precedent transactions, and discounted cash flow. Okay, and you got to know how they work. You got to know the pros and cons of each, and when do we use which one, and why do we use them all together. So those are all fair game, right? M&A questions. So this is like merger math, right? Like accretion, dilution, the different trade-offs between using the different types of different sources of capital. So you could use cash, you could use debt, you could use equity, and then also like, understanding what revenue and cost synergies are, right? So these are all just like different inputs into the M&A model, right? So understanding how that works. And then there's LBO questions, which are stands for leverage buyout, which is like when a private equity firm acquires a company. So it's just another form of M&A, but with more complex capital structure. And knowing the ideal characteristics of like what you look for in an LBO target, understanding how the different capital structure works, like what are all the different types of debt, and like when do you use which one, and what are the pros and cons. Knowing how to calculate the returns, which usually is IRR, and then like paper LBOs. This we see more in like the harder interviews, which tends to be like the elite boutique interviews, where like they'll actually make you write out like an LBO model using pen and paper, right? So like you have to like really understand how the mechanics work and be able to do like the free cash flow calculation and the debt pay down and the IRR calcs and so on and so forth. So last but not least, so I will these 4 categories I will learn in this order from top to bottom, because if you don't know accounting, you're not going to understand valuation. And if you don't know valuation, you can't understand M&A or LBOs, right? So this is an increasing order of or increasing degree of difficulty and decreasing likelihood of showing up on your interviews, right? So that's why you should study in that order. And then last but not least, brain teasers. These are not as common as the other 4s. That's why I put it last. And quite frankly, I think like a lot of banks don't do these anymore, but we are still seeing some banks do these. Like Centerview loves these for some reason, right? So like depending on the bank that you're interviewing for, you'll still want to know how to do brain teasers. And it's not like there's no right answer, but they want to see how you think. Okay, so anyway, that's all I have today. Took a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I want to open up for Q&A. And actually, I don't know, like Carolyn, I know you want to say something too, right? So I don't know if you want to do that now or after the Q&A. And then the free gift that I mentioned for you guys, I'll just touch on that real quick. You can go to this link if you want to grab it. What it is just like a bunch of free training and free resources that we pulled together into a bundle for you guys. There's like resume templates, there's technical cheat sheets, there's like different video trainings that I've created, which is typically like only for our clients. And then like there's also like a mock interview recording in there of like one of our clients, which who did really, really well in recruiting. So you guys can kind of see like, okay, this is kind of the level that I should strive to get to. So I think like a lot of these resources will be really helpful for you guys. So if you guys want to grab it, go ahead and opt into that link. And then, yeah, that'll be it. Carolyn, I guess I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for such a great overview. Again, you really touched on so many different aspects of the recruiting process, and I'm sure this was super helpful for some of our underclassmen members. And it looks like we have about 5 minutes left in the session. If anyone has any questions for Sam, feel free to raise your hand or also just drop them in the chat.
Yeah, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat, guys. And then, I don't know about Carolyn and other people. You guys might have to go. I'm happy to stay on longer and answer questions if you guys have a lot. If you guys don't, then that's totally cool too. But I see Paige raising her hand. Paige, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much. This is a very niche question, but what are I know that like different places in the US are known for different types of investment banking. Like, if you want to do tech, you usually go to the West Coast. And if you want to do like oil and gas, you go to Houston, things like that. What would you say, like, what do you know about firms in Dallas? Like, what is Dallas like? If you wanted to do investment banking, is Dallas a really bad place to go? And do you think that there are like private equity opportunities or like within the investment banking realm, do you think there are growing opportunities there?
Yeah, I think like in Houston, the bigger, and I'll drop this link in the chat, but in Texas, the bigger office is Houston. And that's where like most banks have their oil and gas offices, right? And so Dallas, I don't think every bank has an office there. Like I know, for example, Goldman started a Dallas office, but they do, I believe, real estate. And then they also have kind of like this support function, which is not really front office banking, but it's like people that they kind of like outsource the grunt work to, like they'll spread comps for them and do basic tasks that are like very, very, I guess like repeatable, right? Or like creating company. And so I don't know if Dallas is like the most, is going to have the most opportunity, to be honest. Like if you want to be in Texas, Houston is probably going to have jobs, but that's only like if you're interested in oil and gas, because oil and gas is very different from a lot of the other industries. Like in terms of the type of modeling you do, there's like a whole separate set of technical questions that you have to study if you want to do oil and gas. It's not hard, it's just extra. So, you know, that's something to think about. But like private equity, I mean, you can recruit for private equity from anywhere. Like if you've done banking at a reputable bank, you'll be able to recruit for private equity no matter what. Like just because you do banking in Dallas doesn't mean you can't do PE in New York or on the West Coast, which is like where most of the PE opportunities are for the most part. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you.
Cool. Anyone else?
Yes, Sam, I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
So you said, right, if you want to be like in a top spot, you need like 2 to 3 relevant experiences, which would mean as a freshman, right? Freshman spring, freshman summer, and then sophomore fall.
Yeah.
So let's say I do that, right?
Yeah.
But isn't that like messing me up if I wanted to go into like another career field like tech? Like then I basically just spent all my time doing finance, right?
Yes and no. So you don't have to have 3, right? All I'm saying is because we see a lot of resumes from a lot of students, both like people who we work with and people we don't work with, because like they send us their resume just to talk to us. And so I've seen thousands of resumes at this point over the last like 3 to 4 years. And most of the students that are getting jobs these days, in my experience, they have at least 2 to 3, right? And so that like, yes, it is like preventing you from being able to focus on other potential paths. And that is the really annoying thing about recruiting for banking, is that they're forcing students into making a really early decision about whether banking is what you want to do or not. But I would also say like, look, if you recruit for banking and then let's say you get in and then you do a junior summer internship and then you don't like it, like you hate it. And a lot of people don't like banking after they try it, right? Then you still have all of senior year to pivot to something else. And I mean, depending on what you're trying to pivot to, but like if it's anything on like the business side, right? Like if you go to Wharton and you're a business student and you still want to stay on the business side, then like most companies out there, they love to hire people who have actually gotten banking experience. So it's not like you've kind of cornered yourself into not being able to do those things, right? Because the way they see is like, oh, wow, Danny worked for Morgan Stanley his junior summer. That means he's like the cream of the crop, right? Like he beat out, 95% of the other students and got into banking. And we know he's a workhorse because he did banking. So like working for us is going to be a walk in the park, right? So that's why people always say, oh, bankers have such good exit opportunities. It's like, it's for those reasons, right? And most industries that are like not as competitive, they don't expect you to start recruiting for them until your last year in school anyway. Right. So I don't know like what other career paths you're considering, but I think you mentioned tech, right? It depends on like what you want to do in tech. Like if you want to be an engineer, then I would say that's like, there's not as much overlap there, right? But if you're like working for tech, like what I did was I was more on the business side, I was on the finance and strategy side of things, then I think there's actually a lot of synergies there between, doing banking and then going over and doing some type of business role, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Thanks, Sam. I gotta go now, but yeah, thanks so much.
No problem. Anyone else? Gizem, I don't know if I'm butchering your name, but I apologize.
Yes. Well, it's a good time. Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And I wanted to ask a question following up on the previous question. Would it help or hurt our application if you mentioned that it would be very important to have internships in investment banks or like that you mentioned? But would it help or hurt if we have interned in companies that are not investment banks, but could still we could mention relevant experiences and skills through those internships?
Can you be a little bit more specific? Like what's an example of what you're thinking about?
For instance, if we worked in like a financial news company, such as the Financial Times or Bloomberg, and we can talk about what we've learned there or our research skills. Yes, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if you've done that already, you certainly shouldn't take it off your resume by any means, right? And you absolutely should do your best to spin those experiences in to make it as relevant as possible to investment banking, right? So whether it's you develop research skills or you have to stay up to date on the financial markets or whatever, right? I don't know what you did there. And so it's certainly not going to hurt you, right? What I was saying earlier was just look, going forward between now and whenever you guys finish recruiting, if you're trying to decide hey, what other internships should I take on, and you only have so much time, you should try to ideally prioritize something from the list that I gave you, because those are going to be, it's going to require less spin. Let's just put it that way, right? It's going to be less of a stretch. You can just very easily talk about yeah, this is what I did, this is what I learned, and it's all going to be highly relevant, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks.
Sure. Cool. Anyone else?
Awesome. Well, it looks like if there are any other questions, it looks like we can wrap up. So we just want to thank you again so much, Sam, on behalf of Wharton Women and Wharton Undergraduate Finance Club for hosting such a great session. And again, I know it was especially helpful for some of our underclassmen members. So thank you again for the session.
No, thank you guys for having me. I have fun doing this. And for those of you who showed up, hopefully you guys found it to be helpful. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out, and happy to help you guys out. All right. Cool. Thanks, guys. We'll talk soon. Bye.
Awesome. Thank you.
I just sent you the spreadsheet also.